Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, The Joe Miller Show. We're honored to have with us Ambassador Ken Blackwell, former ambassador to the United Nations, also former Secretary of State, Ohio, Undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And he was also the delegate to the White House Summit on Retirement Savings in 98. Been very active, very much involved in holding the Obama administration to account. He's currently a best-selling author. He's the visiting professor at Liberty University School of Law. Ambassador Blackwell, welcome to the Joe Miller Show.
Brother Joe, it's good to be with you. Good to be with you, sir.
It's been a while since we've chatted. It's very good to hear your voice. I've always been a fan. Very, very excited about what you're continuing to do to hold the Obama administration to account. Tell us a little bit about what's going on currently with efforts to hold the Obama administration accountable. I mean, obviously, out there doing all sorts of things that are extra-constitutional, from amnesty with respect to illegal immigration to other things. What are you doing?
Absolutely. Look, Joe, for the last 7 years, we have seen President Obama and his administration wage an assault on American exceptionalism, both domestically and abroad. And he has put our nation in a very dangerous position. And what I've tried to do is to keep the constant pressure by shining a bright light on these atrocities and these assaults. At home, we've seen an explosion of government and government spending and a refusal to secure our borders, as you just mentioned. Overseas, we've seen him turn his back on the slaughter of Christians and the lovers of liberty. And while we've watched our enemies grow in influence and territory, all the while our reputation as a shining city on the hill, as a nation that is a beacon of liberty and a defender of freedom, has waned, and so. What I've said since this president was a mere nominee in waiting, when before his election, he basically said that we were just a week away from fundamentally transforming our nation. And Joe, he's worked every day of his administration to transform our market economy into a government-managed economy, our family-centered culture into a government-centered culture, and our national philosophy, founded upon the primacy of the individual and the supremacy of God, to one founded upon the primacy of the collective, so-called collective good, and the supremacy of the federal government. And so this is, every day that I get up, it's about being fully engaged in a battle to make a moral case against big government and to try to inspire people through my personal example to get civically engaged. Because to beat this administration, it's going to take intellectual labor, hard work, and political engagement.
And you're a prolific writer. I mean, you've got commentaries been carried across the United States: Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New York Times, Washington Post, Investors Business Daily, FoxNews.com. You're also working in that area as a fellow at the Family Research Council. What are you doing there?
Well, I'm working on what I call family empowerment issues. So I look at turns in the economy and economic policy that impact the family, and this administration has grown the government, increased dependency on the government, and lessened the self-sufficiency of America's families. So every day I try to make the case that this rapid expansion of the welfare state under the Obama administration is not unlike any of the welfare state expansions, totalitarian regimes, throughout human history. And those regimes have done two things. Again, whether they have been to weaken the family, and two, to silence the church. And sure enough, that's what the Obama administration is doing. He's weakening the family, and he's trying to marginalize the church by attacking religious liberty. And I believe religious liberty is the quintessential human right among all of our human rights, because it represents the individual conscience, and it represents our God-given gift to exercise free will.
And it blows me away. I mean, here you got a president that at an Easter prayer breakfast, a couple of weeks ago, mentioning how disgusted he is with some of the Christian faith, with how they've acted. And of course, he was making a reference to what was going on in Indiana with the Religious Restoration Freedom Act, and of course the vitriolic response to that legislation that was identical to basically 30 other states in the federal government's act. I mean, it was just really a fiction. It was created by opponents of religious freedom. It shocks me to where we're at right now in the country, because you had the first freedom, you got the First Amendment, right? You had a number of people, founders, this country, come here out of a desire to be able to practice their religion without restraint, without the limits of government. And yet we're now at a point where sexual behavior trumps religious freedom. What's your perspective on what's going on there?
Well, I tell you, former Attorney General Ed Meese and I did a piece for Investors Business Daily a couple of weeks ago entitled Religious Freedom. What about the florist and the baker? And the point that we were trying to make is what you just made, is that, we've grown as a human community, as a democracy, until the most prosperous, the most diverse human democracy in all of human history. It just seems counterintuitive to me and to Ed Meese that a nation that was founded upon folks who were willing to cross the ocean, fight the trials and tribulations of a new land and the wilderness, so that they, in fact, could have religious freedom, would now have its first black president who prides himself in being from the state of Lincoln, turn his sights on attacking the very thing that has made us an exceptional nation. Because, look, my dad was a high school graduate. He was a meat packer. But he was a guy who loved to read. Both of my parents just loved to read. And my dad used to talk in common sense terminology. And his favorite paragraph was that second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, because he thought that sort of set the frame around our Constitution. And, it starts out, we hold these truths to be self-evident. My dad was fond of saying that's the highfalutin way of saying any knucklehead should be able to get this. We're all invested with certain human rights, not by government, but by God. So our human rights are not grants from government. They're gifts from God, and there's not a government on the face of the earth that can give you those human rights. That governments can only protect and enhance the environment so that you can exercise those human rights. But Obama has turned it on its head. He wants us to believe that our human rights are grants from government, and therefore it makes it easier for him to try to run and chase God out of the public square. And instead of having a God-centered culture, that we have a government-centered culture. And he would like for us to worship at the altar of big government. But there are too many of us who understand that, we must take a stand. We really, every day that we get up, we must take a stand. We realize that there's been a fault line that has been drawn that stretches from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And on one side are the advocates and apologists for big government, and on the other side are the advocates of freedom and the individual liberties that are so crucial to the American tradition and our country's future.
And we're going to talk more about that. Ambassador Ken Blackwell on the Joe Miller Show, talking about the divide that's occurring, how we need to take a stand. I mean, these are important issues, fundamental freedoms at stake. And if we just sit back and let these things continue to go, we're going to wake up tomorrow and not have the freedoms that this country was founded on. Stay with us. The Joe Miller Show, again, Ambassador Ken Blackwell with us. Be back in just a few minutes. Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, the Joe Miller Show. We're honored to still have with us Ken Blackwell, Ambassador Ken Blackwell. He was the mayor of Cincinnati, treasurer and secretary of state for Ohio, undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. He's also been a delegate to White House Summit, obviously very engaged in the culture wars. He's currently a fellow at the Family Research Council and the American Civil Rights Union. Ambassador Blackwell, thank you for staying with us.
Hey, Joe, it's good to be with you, sir.
So, one of the things that I've seen over my short period of time here on Earth, I'm almost 50. I shouldn't say that. I'm 47, going on 48. But I remember just going back to the high school era and thinking about this concept of, homosexual marriage, at least in the Midwest, was just such a foreign concept it wasn't even discussed. But to think about, how things were then, about 30 years ago compared to how they are now, our culture has undergone just a radical shift. And that's despite the fact that there's still a fairly significant portion of our culture today, probably over 50%, that embraces traditional marriage, believes that that is the best thing for people, is against the homosexual agenda. What's happened to where we're now at every movie that we go to almost, we're presented with this homosexual subplot, where if you put out a piece of legislation to protect religious freedom, like in Indiana, you get the vitriol of virtually every conventional media outlet, save some of the conservative networks. How did we get to where we're at today?
Well, for at least 20 years, the left, the homosexual movement and lobby, they've been engaged in an all-out cultural war, and they've established beachheads in those institutions that have a substantial impact on culture, and that's whether it be the media, the news media, whether it be the Hollywood, whether it be the dominance in our academies across the country, whether we're talking about universities and college campuses, as well as public school systems. They have, in the old Lewis Carroll Humpty Dumpty series, Humpty Dumpty said, "He who defines is the master." And what they've done is they've been on an all-out push to redefine and reshape our culture. And so religious liberty, attack on religious liberty, is just part of this assault. And just think about the definition of marriage. Marriage has been accepted as a union between a man and a woman for over 2,500 years. And it is held as being the design of God for advancing the human community in a respectful and a free way. If, in fact, we now say that love is the primary and dominant determiner of who should be married, what stops it at one man and another man, one woman and another woman? Why not one woman and two men, or three women and one man, if in fact they all profess to love. And people say, oh, that's over the top. Well, it's not over the top. There are more now cultures in the world that practice polygamy than practice homosexual marriage. And as soon as this floodgate is open, we're going to see the institution of marriage as Western civilization, as we have known it for thousands of years, be turned on its head. And those of us who hold to that the traditional natural definition of marriage are going to be ostracized and marginalized and defined as being bigots, out of tune, and of a different world. We just can't
right.
let
Also,
that happen. We can't let that happen.
Also called haters and worse, obviously. The problem is that, the conduit for this change is not just the media, TV, Hollywood, the schools. It's also the federal court system. I mean, it just amazes me at the rapidity of legal change that's taken place over the last several years, where now the 14th Amendment is being construed to allow for gay marriage. And you would think that the higher thinkers, although I'm starting to think that a lot of those folk in the black robes aren't higher thinkers, would recognize that by doing what they're doing, they're eliminating all parameters for marriage.
Oh, you're absolutely right.
Can't be no rational.
Hey, look, the Obama administration and the left, they see the Constitution as being a malleable, always changing, always shapeable document. They don't see it as an enduring document, that when it needs to be changed, there are prescribed methods for which you change it. And we've done it, over 20 times.
Right.
And so now all of a sudden, through activist judges, through judicial activists, we are watching them change the culture from the bench. We've watched them marginalize legislative bodies from state legislatures to Congress, and the courts are now starting to be the arbiters of culture, not the people or their representatives, and it must change. And so it's an attack on religious liberty. It is an advancement of big government with programs like Obamacare. It is an attack on liberty by Obama saying that he's contemplating banning bullets since he can't figure out how to take our Second Amendment rights and our guns from us. He's just saying we're going to think about how we can ban bullets. He's handing off our national sovereignty and national security to the United Nations. And so this is a comprehensive attack, and we must be fully awake and fully engaged. Joe, you said something a little while ago. I mean, I about the expansion of the welfare state being, sort of propped up by four wooden-headed ideas, as far as I'm concerned. The first is that government can manage our lives and our economy better than we can. The other, the government can do a better job of raising our families than we can. The other notion is that the old-fashioned work ethic is dead. And I tell people all the time, we are rapidly becoming a culture where earning money doesn't entitle you to it, but wanting money does. And we've just watched this expansion of the welfare state through government dependence. But the fourth leg is what you mentioned a while ago, and that is this wooden-headed notion that moral absolutes don't exist. And so it is moral relativism, what feels good goes, and that nothing is any more tied to absolute truth. And
it's
that's
all
a very dangerous situation for us to get in. And those who, in fact, profess to think that Martin Luther King in contemporary America led the way through great civil rights advancement, he did it because he believed not in moral relativism, but moral absolutes. And
it's had a devastating impact.
That's right. And if in fact we start to give in to this moral relativism, to these cultural impulses that we can't do for ourselves, but that we're totally dependent on government, that we no longer respect our national borders, we start to cheapen American citizenship. And once you do that, you weaken American exceptionalism, and then you find that he has succeeded, or the left has succeeded, in fundamentally transforming our culture and our country.
And you look at the family, I mean, it's an absolute shambles. I was at Heritage, this was several years back. I think I talked about this at the Family Research Council too, about how now single-headed households are having more children than traditional households. And that is only going to continue on that trajectory unless we get this thing switched around. And the problem is, I mean, that's the fundamental block of culture. I mean, if you tear down the family, what do you have left? I mean, you don't have much of anything. So Ambassador Blackwell, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I say you tear down the family, you silence the church, you change the nature of who we are as a people.
And we got to continue the fighting. Ken, I really appreciate the work that you've done. You've been very effective, and not just obviously your writing, but also your work with the Family Research Council, your work as an ambassador. We're honored to have you here on the show talking about what we've got to do as a nation to bring everything back to where we need to be in order to restore that position that we had, the bright, shining city on the hill. And what is your call to action now for people? I mean, what should people do? What can they do in their own area of influence in order to help this country return to its foundation?
As we're told in the scriptures, be unafraid, take a stand, show up, punch holes in the darkness by making sure that you hold your special light high and strong.
Ambassador Ken Blackwell, culture warrior, thank you so much for being on the Joe Miller Show.
God bless you, Joe. All the best.
God bless you, too. We'll be back with you here in just a few minutes. The Joe Miller Show.